Hi, welcome to part two of the last one. This is the follow-on. I didn't call it part one, but I'm calling this part two. We want to continue where we left off. And hey, hi, I'm Stephen Whitsitt. This is the Basement Bible Breakdown, bringing you live. My rantings and ravings and preachings and sermons and whatever such, straight live from my basement. So I wanted to continue on from our previous discussion of why and what is Middleism. And as I brought up the different things, of course, if you remember correctly, it is not a partial, it is not dispensationalist. I believe that all of it fulfilled, but there is no promise of a second coming. And this is the position of the early church fathers. They all believe the Olivet was fulfilled, but there was no second coming in that first century. I also argued for the late date for Revelation. And as I began to get into was, when we had to cut off, was the Olivet and Revelation split. Now, here's my foundation for why I would split the two up. And it's a mistake of both preterism and dispensation, trying to hook these two up. One, if we've removed the idea that it talks about the Son of Man coming in clouds is the second coming, then therefore the Olivet has nothing to do with the second coming. It has nothing to do with the rapture. It has nothing to do with that. We have to apply the context of what is being said there to 70 AD. That begins with what? Matthew 23. All the blood of the prophets, from Abel all the way up to Zechariah, who they slew between the altars. This is what the revenge and the vindication is about, is those who are slain. Secondly, he said the judgment will come also for rejection of him, the Messiah. So that means then that not one stone would be left upon another. So this is a judgment coming from Christ on Jerusalem for their rejection of him. That is where we get the idea that there are some standing there that will see that judgment come. They will see Jesus come into the kingdom, and coming in his kingdom. I mean, his kingdom is in heaven, not on earth at this time. It's in heaven, and he's coming into his kingdom in heaven and sitting down at the right hand of the Father. Matthew 26, sitting down at the right hand of the Father, Son of Man coming on clouds, is all about language of him going into heaven. So when we separate those two, and we have that, the context then, of course, of the Olivet has everything to do with about the events of 70 AD. Now, since we agree on that part, I won't dwell too much on how that all is fulfilled and all that for the full preterist. But when I go to the book of Revelations, I'm going to look at the context there. This is judgment, the judgment on the seven churches to begin with. That's the first thing in the warning. The judgment always comes on the house of God first. So what does Revelation start with? The seven judgments. When do they start to happen? Soon. They are happening in that time period that there's a judgment on those churches. Not to say that there was not going to be a further judgment that happens in the end times. As we would look at, and we'll talk about here in a minute, and I'll prove it to you why. But the context then of the judgment is upon the world of the ungodly. 2 Peter 3, upon the world of the ungodly. Just like in Noah's day, the judgment was there upon the world of the ungodly, and Christians had a way of escape. In this judgment here, upon the world and the ungodly, Christians are going to have a way of escape out of that. Through it. It doesn't mean they get raptured out. I reject the idea of a pre-trib rapture. I thoroughly believe that the church will go through it, based on Revelations 13, where it says that the beast is allowed to make war on the saints, and to do this for 42 months, and to have power and control. In the same way that the Romans did. They had complete power over the church. They persecuted the church. There was no sense of the church being taken out of Rome or protected from the persecution. But it was that in the middle of that persecution is where the church grew. And I believe the same thing will happen through the tribulation. The church is going to grow and get solid in preparation for his second coming. So the context then of Revelation has to do with the whole world, the judgment upon the whole world. And it says it all the way through there. This will come upon the whole world. The judgments, the trumpets, the vials, and all of these things will come upon that, and it come upon the beast. Now, in rejection of dispensationalist key points, I want to make it very clear. By separating the Olivet from the Revelation, of course, the problems that are created is by trying to mix the two and trying to prove the events of the Olivet are fulfilled in the Revelation. And it can't do it. That's what creates problems between all of them. So I would hold that there's not going to be any need for a temple to be rebuilt. And definitely, Jerusalem is not destroyed in the Revelations. Not at all. And here, well, I was going to get into that in another tape, but let's go to it. Let's go to it. Where do I get the idea that the two of them are completely different? Well, start in Zechariah 12. Let me bring out a few verses. It says, "Behold, I am about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding people. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. And on that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who lift it will surely hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it." Well, let's look in chapter 14. "Behold, a day is coming when the spoil will be taken from you, and you will be divided in your midst. And I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day his feet shall stand in the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem, and on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two." Goes on. "Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him." Same thing. The siege, the destruction, everything else. Now, why is it I don't put... well, first of all, we identified that these two passages are second coming passages. It is absolutely clear. Revelations 1:7, he quotes Zechariah 12:10. "They will look on him who they have pierced. They shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child." And he is associating that with this second coming. And so the passage there has to do with the second coming. Now you say, well, the siege, well, that was the siege of 70, so therefore he came in 70. Okay, let's go down a little bit. Let's look at what the language actually says there in 12. It says, "On that day, that declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with panic and its rider with madness. But for the sake of the house of Judah, I will keep my eye open when I strike every horse of the people with blindness. Then the clans of Judah shall say to them, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have strength through the Lord of hosts their God." Was that true about 70 AD? Did the inhabitants have strength from the Lord their God? No. "On that day I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot in the midst of wood," means setting fire to everything, "like a flaming torch among sheaves. That Judah will set the place on fire. The glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not surpass that of Judah." But I thought Jerusalem was the whore of Babylon. But here it's what? On that day that he comes. What does it say? "The glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not surpass that of Judah." And then here's the key thing in verse 8. And you cannot escape this. "On that day the Lord will protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem." Okay, so you have a siege, and on that day he will protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I mean, that is just undeniable. That's what it says. You can't symbolize it. It's not metaphorical. You can't sit there and say this is the New Jerusalem or anything else. Because again, on that day I will seek to destroy all the nations that came against Jerusalem. On that day he will protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem. He did not protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem on that day. None of them. Judah, there was no glory for Judah. There was no glory for the inhabitants, the house of David, or anything else. And that was it. Jerusalem was destroyed. We'll go to 14 in a second. "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy." Pleas of grace and mercy. "So that when they look on me, on whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn." Here's where I would argue theologically and see if we can catch that. A spirit of grace and please. That mourning is one of mourning, of deep sorrow, like you've lost an only child. Okay, who is God's only child? Jesus. And who was he? The Messiah. Did they reject him? Yes. So when they look on me, on whom they have pierced, they will mourn for him. The idea comes from also Romans 11. In all this way, Israel will be saved. It is my contention, listen very closely, that when Christ comes back, the Jews, all the tribes of the earth will see him come, as every eye will see him, and they will mourn in repentance. They will recognize this is Jesus that they rejected 2,000 years ago, or however long it would be. This is the one who is coming, and they will mourn as if they've lost the first child when they realize that they did kill the Messiah, that they didn't recognize him would come. And so repentance will come upon all of Israel at one time. Anybody who is a Jew and cares about God or anything else is going to sit there and say, wow, we blew it. And that way, all of Israel will be saved. And yes, there are other scholars who do agree with that. And just a note, I find it completely ridiculous. Well, you're not a scholar. Okay, please define what a scholar is for me. And I've had people sit there and tell, well, somebody who has actually studied and knows Greek and Hebrew and everything else, and they have degrees. Okay, thank you. That's what I got. I have 2 degrees, master's degrees, Greek and Hebrew. So, yes, I am considered a scholar. I'm working on my thesis right now to finish that up, and it'll be published here I'm hoping by the end of September or so. Hopefully, God, Lord willing, on all of that. But I'm sorry, you can sit there and say scholars. Well, okay, this is my opinion, and it is the same opinions of a lot of other people. A lot of other scholars have the same ideas. But the big problem, of course, is that dispensationalism is so entrenched that most scholars are still putting the Olivet and Revelation together here in the Western churches, but most in England and some in Europe, that's not happening whatsoever. It is mostly a dispensational thing that does that. So again, in Zechariah, getting back to there. Now when we come to chapter 14, what do we see? Behold, the day is coming when the spoils will be taken from you, divided in your midst. And I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, the houses plundered, and weapons raped. Half the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Okay, I agree. This is 70 AD. Why is it 70 AD? Go down here. Verse 11. And it shall be, Jerusalem shall be inhabited, for there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. Well, when did that happen after 70 AD? I mean, 70 AD was the last time it was destroyed, and that was according to the prophecy of Christ. So you're not going to sit there and tell me that, what? There will never be another decree of utter destruction. Well, Jerusalem shall dwell in security. What does that assume then? That Jerusalem will exist again later, and that it will dwell in security. In other words, it won't be invaded as we saw, or destroyed, laid siege to, or any of those other things in the same way it was done in 70. It has to be afterwards. This is the day of the coming. On that day, the Lord will protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem and here, and it shall be inhabited. There shall never be another decree of destruction. Well, if Revelation was written later, how can Revelation have a decree of destruction? If this decree, the last one, was fulfilled in 70, then there's no way that there can be another decree of destruction for Jerusalem. And we come into the New Testament where Israel and church has been grafted into one vine. How can you sit there and say that Jerusalem deserves to be judged for apostasy or for failure for the old covenant, or even in failure to keep the new covenant? There's no reason for Israel to be judged in that manner again. There is no other written decree after what Jesus prophesied in the Olivet. There has been no other decree And so that was fulfilled in 70. There cannot be another one. So Jerusalem shall be inhabited. It will remain loft. And then what does it say in verse 16? Then everyone who survives the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Booths. It means there will be survivors, and the Lord will be king over the earth, and people will worship the Lord. That's why in Revelations 20 it says what? The camp of the saints, the city he loves. The army that surrounds Jerusalem for the second time, that Satan opens up, and we'll get into that another time. It says that it is the camp of the saints, the city he loves. He never gave up on Jerusalem. And the mere fact that he promised when he does return, it will be Jerusalem, tells us that Jerusalem still and Israel plays a major part in the end of all things. All right, well, thank you for sticking around long enough to listen to this. I appreciate it. If you want to subscribe to my channel, that would be great. But keep tuned in, because it seems like lately I've been having a lot of time to get a lot of videos out. So again, we will see you on the flip side, and thank you for watching.